The email came at 5:12 a.m., time-stamped from my mother's personal address, signed off with her usual flourish, "Warmly Colette Vale." Subject line, "Vow Renewal, updated guest list." I knew better than to click it, but I did anyway. The message was 3 sentences long. "Hi, sweetheart, we've decided to keep the ceremony intimate, just family and important guests. Hope you understand." That was it. No greeting, no details. No direct mention of me, even though the subtext was as sharp as a knife. And I've read enough contracts in my life to know what's not written often speaks louder than what is. Just family and important guests. I was neither. I stared at the screen in the quiet cabin of Andara, still docked along the Florida Keys, and let the words wash over me. Not with rage, not even sadness. Just that cold, clean sensation of clarity, like flipping on overhead lights in a house you already knew was empty. My name is Brenna Vale. I'm 34 years old, founder and CEO of Mistral Marine, a private yacht design company that supplies to dignitaries royals and the quietly ultra-rich. I've been called a genius by some, a ghost by others, but most days I'm just the girl who used to sit at the edge of the dock behind my father's resort, sketching boats I wasn't allowed to touch. I didn't reply to her email. There wasn't a point. Instead, I forwarded it to Dorian, my chief of logistics, with a single line, "Proceed with launch confirmation. Keep security discreet. Andara docks June 9th, 1600 hours. The same day as the Vow Renewal. The same beachside town. The same shoreline my father had once walked me off of, saying, 'If you're going to chase fairy tales, do it far from here. This family's built on salt, sweat, and structure, not dreams.' I guess he forgot salt builds boats, too. They didn't know I was coming, but I wasn't crashing anything. I had no intention of entering their ceremony, no plan to make a scene. That would have given them too much credit. This wasn't about being seen. This was about being undeniable. The Vow Renewal, my parents' second wedding, as my mother called it, was taking place on the lawn of the resort. They've run for years a carefully staged performance of legacy and reputation. The guest list I'd later learned through someone else included my brother Jasper and his new wife, a retired Navy admiral, 2 social media influencers, and a mid-tier local politician whose wife adored my mother's sangria recipe. Meanwhile, the harbor just north of that very lawn, the one they used to forbid me from stepping foot on, had been reserved months ago under a holding name that traced back to me. Andara, my newest design, would arrive fully staffed and fully press-ready. Not for them, for my clients, for my legacy. Still, the symmetry of it all wasn't lost on me. 15 years ago, they told me my obsession with hull curvature and engine placements was cute, but unsustainable. When I left home at 24, they didn't stop me. When I graduated from marine engineering under an alias, they didn't notice. When my company secured its first international defense contract through blind bidding, they cheered for my brother's engagement instead. I wasn't angry anymore. You don't stay angry this long and survive. Instead, I got quiet. I built. I moved in silence. And now, without saying a single word to either of them, I would be present at their big day, not seated in the family row, not included in the toasts or the slideshow, but docked just behind their ceremony, floating on the manifestation of everything they told me I couldn't become. The funny thing about yachts is that they don't need applause to be majestic. They don't need permission to exist. They just glide in. I closed the laptop, stood from my built-in desk, and looked out the wide pane of glass that framed the ocean like a gallery piece. Crew members were already moving quietly on deck. Dorian was walking the harbor perimeter with a clipboard. The water was calm, the skies clear. June 9th was forecasted to be perfect, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. I used to think if I played by their rules long enough, I'd earn my way into their version of love. That if I sat still at Sunday brunch, nodded through lectures about stability, and smiled in family photos I didn't belong in, they'd eventually see me, not just look past me. But the truth is, I was never trying to become their perfect daughter. I was just trying not to be their disappointment. Back then, I was 2 semesters into a mechanical engineering master's program at Tulane. I had the grades, the grants, the carefully chosen internships. My father told everyone at the resort I was going to fix submarines for the Navy, even though I never once said that out loud. What I had said on more than one occasion was that I loved boats. Not war machines, not oil rigs, just boats. Their shape, their logic, their quiet language. Hull angles made more sense to me than social niceties ever had. And deep down, I already knew I didn't want to fix other people's designs. I wanted to build my own. The break came one night in March. I was sitting in the back row of a guest lecture on fluid dynamics, and all I could think about was a sketch I'd done weeks earlier. A 32-meter solar-assisted catamaran with an asymmetrical bow. The kind of thing that would have made my professors raise their eyebrows, too unconventional, too whimsical, too art school. But it felt right. I kept drawing it late at night between lab reports and meetings with advisors. I'd even started emailing designers I admired, asking questions anonymously. One of them, a Norwegian architect with a studio in Key West, invited me to visit his workshop. No promises, he said. But bring your sketches. I told no one. I rented a zip car and drove 8 hours straight. When I arrived, sunburned and shaking, he looked through my notebook in silence for almost 20 minutes, then said, "You didn't learn this in class." I nodded. "Good," he replied. "Stay that way." He offered me a 6-month unpaid apprenticeship on the spot. When I told my father, he didn't speak for a full minute. Then he laughed once short sharp and said, "So you're dropping out of a fully funded program to go tinker with rich people's toys in Florida?" I said yes. My mother started crying before I could explain anything. "You have a future," she said. "You have a name. Do you know what people will say?" My brother Jasper leaned against the kitchen island with that smirk he always had when I failed at something. "What people?" "She doesn't even come home anymore," he said. "She's already halfway out." I left that night. No suitcase. Just a backpack with my laptop, 2 pencils, and the sketchbook that had started it all. I slept on a friend's couch for 2 weeks before moving into a boatyard trailer that cost $450 a month and smelled like paint thinner. Every day I sanded fiberglass and swept metal shavings and sketched until my fingers cramped. Every night I told myself I'd be worth something someday, even if they never saw it. 3 months later, my aunt called to check on me. She was the only one who ever did. "Your mom says you moved to Key West for a boy," she said gently. "I didn't know you were seeing anyone. I wasn't. There was no boy. Just the same old story. They couldn't make sense of me, so they rewrote the plot. I wasn't just rejected. I was replaced, reframed, redacted. At first I tried to defend myself. I sent emails explaining what I was doing, photos of the boats we built, even a Christmas card with a short note and a sketch on the back. They never replied. My brother unfollowed me on everything. My father blocked my number after I asked him to stop forwarding me job listings at Lockheed. My mother sent a single text in January. "Just hope you know what you're doing." I did. Or at least I was trying to. By the time Mistral Marine filed its first patent, no one in my family knew I was still in the marine world. When we shipped our first private commission and eco-retreat tender for a billionaire couple in Australia, I thought about calling my dad just once just to say, "You were wrong." But I didn't. I wasn't angry enough for revenge. I wasn't soft enough for reconciliation. I was something else, entirely tired of auditioning for a role I never wanted. That's why the email all these years later didn't shock me. The wound had closed long ago. But sometimes the scar still itched, especially when it came wrapped in polite language like just family and important guests. I wasn't either of those things to them. But soon, I'd be something they couldn't ignore. The deck of Andara always felt different in the morning. Quieter. More alive in its own way. The teak beneath my bare feet still carried the warmth of yesterday's sun, and the curved steel railings glinted like someone had polished them just for me. But no one had. My crew was meticulous, yes, but this yacht didn't need flattery. It was made to shine. $45 million. 28 months of design engineering and fabrication. 127 patentable elements, 7 of which were mine. And no one outside this harbor knew I had touched a single line of it. That was how I liked it. The press materials listed Andara as a collaboration between Mistral Marine and a collective of elite marine architects. No names, no headshots, Just form function and seamless innovation. Most of our clients preferred it that way. Privacy was the new luxury. And for me, anonymity was freedom. You can't erase someone if you never admitted they were there. I walked to the starboard side, slowly checking the alignment of the carbon fiber panels, letting my fingertips trail the hull like I used to trace boat blueprints with my knuckles as a kid. Every angle of this vessel had been fought for budget battles, sleepless design revisions, water tank tests that nearly derailed the hydroplaning system. But here she was, floating like she was born on air. "You're early." Dorian's voice came from behind me, low steady, already 2 coffees in. He was the closest thing I had to a co-founder, though we never used that term. He had a background in aviation manufacturing, a mechanical brain wired like a conductor. We met at a subcontractor meeting 7 years ago. I sent him a napkin sketch across the table. He nodded once. That was enough. "Couldn't sleep," I said, turning toward him. He handed me a small envelope. "Legal just confirmed. We're locked in for the 9th. Full harbor access security cleared coordination with catering. And yes, same day as the veil ceremony." I didn't blink. "Any pushback?" He shook his head. "Nothing that matters. Local zoning board approved everything months ago. They'd have to crawl backward through 5 shell companies to trace it to us." That made me smile. Not out of malice, just satisfaction. Because that's how you do it. You don't barge into their party screaming for attention. You rent the land next door. You build your own house. Then you raise the roof just high enough that they can't ignore the shadow. I slipped the envelope into my back pocket and looked out at the water. The resort was barely visible from here, just a sliver of white stucco behind the trees, flanked by lounge chairs and manufactured tranquility. My father had built it on an inheritance he never admitted came from my mother's side. For decades, he told people he built it from scratch. But I knew where the down payment came from. I knew who lost her name on the deed. It didn't matter now. I wasn't coming for the resort. I didn't want their ceremony. I wasn't showing up to confront them or disrupt the speeches or make some kind of poetic scene. That would have required anger I no longer felt. This wasn't about them. Not really. It was about Andara, about what it meant to launch something that defied everything they told me I couldn't be. I didn't need them to see me anymore, but I wanted them to see her. Because in every bolt, every curve, every quiet hum of her engines, there was proof that I had existed all along and I had done it without them. Dorian pulled out his tablet. "You want to preview the guest list, media buyers for prospective clients. No press from Florida outlets per your instructions. But we're getting pokes from international brokers. Keep it that way," I said. "No local coverage. If they find out, it won't be from us." He nodded. That was the other rule, let them come to the story late. That way, they'd never be sure whether you meant for them to see it or not. A breeze picked up off the water. In the distance, a gull cut through the sky and vanished over the palm tree line near the resort. I wondered if the reception tables had been set yet, if the string quartet had started rehearsing, if my name had even crossed their minds. I doubted it. People like them don't remember who they erase, only the parts they replace you with. But I remember everything, and I don't need to raise my voice. And Dara would do it for me. There was a time I believed that place would be part of my future, not because I wanted it. God, I never wanted to run a beachfront inn with themed brunch menus and matching staff polos, but because it had been promised, not in a signed contract or notarized clause. In the casual way families pass down expectations. The way my grandfather used to say, "One day, Brenna will run this place tighter than any Navy crew while letting me count the keys at the front desk, or ride the dumbwaiter when no guests were around." The Vale Shore Resort wasn't just a family business, it was my family's centerpiece. The photographs on the lobby walls were all staged smiles and stiff poses year after year, ribbon cuttings, sandcastle contests, wedding packages. I was in the early photos. Then I wasn't. I didn't realize I'd been cut out until I turned 25. A routine call from the family estate attorney, someone who had known me since I had baby teeth, had gone oddly formal. I had reached out to request documents for a financial aid application. I wasn't asking for money, just paperwork. He told me in the gentlest corporate tone he could muster that I was no longer a beneficiary of the Vale Family Trust. effective when I'd asked, stunned. He hesitated. Then, last update was just after your 25th birthday. I assumed you were made aware. I hadn't been. My voice cracked when I asked who made the change. But I already knew. My father had always treated the trust like a scoreboard. Perform and you stayed in the game. Deviate and you vanished. When I left grad school and moved to Key West to build boats, I didn't just disappoint him, I embarrassed him. And there's nothing my father hates more than visible failure. No explanation came. No phone call. Just a quiet revision in an office I wasn't welcome in. My name erased not from sentiment but from the paperwork. And that was the part that still made my chest tighten even now as I stood on the boardwalk just beyond the resort's trimmed hedges, unrecognized and irrelevant. It had been nearly 10 years since I'd been here. Nothing had changed. The faded turquoise umbrellas, the same sea glass lanterns lining the cafe patio. Even the woman at the hostess stand looked familiar, maybe someone's daughter now old enough to work summer shifts. I watched as a valet guided a middle-aged couple into a golf cart with embroidered towels. The man was on his phone. The woman was pointing toward the garden terrace, probably deciding where to take their anniversary photo. I wondered if they'd be at the Vow Renewal. The public boardwalk ran along the southern edge of the resort, technically open to everyone, but designed in such a way that outsiders rarely lingered. There were no benches, no public art. Just a subtle narrowing of the path flanked by manicured shrubs and passive signage private use area beyond this point. I stayed just on the legal side of it. From here, I could see the edge of the ceremony lawn white chairs already lined in perfect rows, each with a satin ribbon and monogrammed program. The breeze carried the faint scent of lilies and salt. It wasn't grief I felt. Not anymore. It was something slower, quieter, like watching someone else live a version of your life that had never been yours to begin with. 2 young employees rolled a sound system across the grass. Neither looked twice at me. In their world, I was just another sunburned tourist walking past a place I couldn't afford to stay. They weren't wrong. Not long ago, that had been exactly true. I thought of my mother, her pressed linen dresses, and perfect diction. Her skill at pretending discomfort was charm. She would be checking flower arrangements right about now, making sure the cocktail napkins had the new monogram M&C Vale Est. 1986, renewed 2023. I wondered if she'd pause. If she'd look toward the boardwalk and think of me. Probably not. She had always believed legacy was about image, appearances. Who showed up and who stayed quiet. And I had done her the courtesy of staying very quiet for a very long time. Until now. I checked my watch. Dorian would be arriving at the marina within the hour to finalize staging on Andara. From the resort lawn, the yacht wouldn't be visible yet, not until we brought her around the southern inlet, not until she cleared the mangrove line and moved into view. But soon, she'd glide into frame like a painting unveiled. I turned away from the hedge. I didn't need to watch them rehearse their version of permanence. They had written me out of the story. But the water remembered, and it carried my name. The forwarded email landed in my inbox 2 nights before the ceremony. Subject line: "Did you mean to miss this?" The sender was Janet Holler, our former neighbor, part-time baker, and full-time gossip engine in a tennis visor. I hadn't heard from her in at least 4 years, not since she ran into me at a trade show in Tampa and said Brenna Vale, like those veils. Her message was only 2 sentences long. "Thought you might want to see who made the cut. Seems odd. Hope you're doing well, sweetheart." Attached was the full guest list for the Vow Renewal, likely pulled from a group thread between moms with too much time and not enough boundaries. I opened it out of habit, not curiosity, and still, somehow, it landed like a punch. There they were, one by one, my brother Jasper and his wife, of course, listed as Jasper and Rachel Vale's son and daughter-in-law. Rachel's parents complete with doctor titles and a line noting their recent mention in Coastal Living. 3 of Dad's former Navy buddies, including one I remembered only as Uncle Brett, who used to let us steer his speedboat for 5 minutes and call it a life lesson. And near the bottom, Blake and Danielle Kay, a reality TV couple I recognized from a dating competition where they'd met arguing over who got the master suite. Not a single mention of me. Not in the family section. Not as a friend. Not even in the honored guests category where the local pastor and a friend caterer had somehow earned space. I read through it twice. Then a third time. I don't know what I was looking for. Some ghost line, some note in parentheses that said, "We tried to reach her or she declined quietly." But no. I wasn't even footnoted. I simply wasn't there. At the bottom of the email in bolded serif font sat the line that took my breath away for half a second. Formal attire. Family only. I stared at it for a long time. Not out of pain, but recognition. This was the part they were good at, the curated exclusion. Make it pretty. Make it polite. Make it seem like a standard. That way, no one would question why someone was missing, because the dress code had already decided who counted. I closed the laptop without replying to Janet. What could I say that wouldn't turn into fuel for her next lunch table story? Instead, I opened a different browser tab. My designer's site had already been bookmarked Ela Norana Tellier, a woman I'd worked with on a commission for a yacht gala in Cannes the year before. Ela didn't do off the rack. She did statements stitched from silence and steel. I typed a message: need a silk jumpsuit, coastal wind resistant. Color black pearl or midnight bronze. Structured neckline. I want to feel like a ship with engines off, still powerful, still impossible to ignore. Need it by the 8th. Her reply came within the hour. Already sketching. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of Andara's lighting system soft in the background. Outside, the marina was quiet, the kind of hush that only existed before big things moved. This wouldn't be a crash. It wouldn't be a scene. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't weep. I wouldn't show up waving a childhood photo and demanding a seat. That would have given them a reason to look down on me. That would have given them power. Instead, I'd glide in as if I had somewhere better to be. Because I did. I wouldn't walk the aisle, but I'd arrive by water, not on their guest list, but on their horizon. The sea was glass that morning, not the kind of smooth that begged for a sailboat, but the heavy kind, still and thick like the ocean was holding its breath. I woke early on Andara, the filtered sunlight slipping through the curved skylight above my berth. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I heard the faint clink of champagne bottles being unloaded on the upper deck and remembered it was the day of the Vow Renewal. And I was already here. I didn't move for a while, just lay there, arms tucked beneath my head, staring at the slatted shadows above me as the engines thrummed quietly beneath the hull. They weren't even on, just cycling through their systems, a kind of preparation, like lungs expanding. By the time I got to the main deck, the crew was already in motion. Elise, our interior lead, was inspecting glasses in her crisp gray uniform, counting off a list under her breath. Dorian was talking to the local harbor master on his headset, jaw clenched but tone polite. Everyone worked with that soft urgency reserved for luxury, never rushed, but always aware that perfection didn't arrive by accident. "Morning, Ms. Vale," Elise said when she saw me. "Forecast holds. No wind, minimal swell, high visibility." She handed me a clipboard with timing notes for docking media access and the internal tour schedule. I barely glanced at it. "Thank you," I said. "Don't let the guests see any branding until we clear the inlet." She nodded and moved on. No one questioned me on this yacht. It wasn't about ego. It was about design. Every inch of Andara had come from my hand, from the angle of the arching bow to the tone of the lighting against the dark, brushed metal. I'd spent years building things no one believed I could. And now I was preparing to pull right up behind the very people who told me I'd never be more than an embarrassment. I stepped out to the bow, barefoot, a coffee in one hand, and let the morning wrap around me. From here, I could just make out the fringe of the resort. White tents fluttered like stiff flags, and small, well-dressed figures moved among them, setting chairs, checking centerpieces, rehearsing the choreography of a day meant to appear effortless. I wondered if my mother was micromanaging the florist, if my brother was already on his second mimosa, If someone had joked that at least Brenna won't ruin this one. My last real conversation with my father had been 3 years ago. I'd flown to Charleston for a design symposium and made the mistake of texting him thinking maybe we could meet for lunch. He agreed reluctantly. We sat on a quiet patio downtown, and I showed him photos of a yacht we'd just launched for a Saudi investor, sleek, minimal solar enhanced. He didn't look at a single image. Just sipped his tea, leaned back and said, "All this? It's fine, but it's not legacy." I blinked. "Excuse me, legacy," he repeated. "Family. Tradition. You're out there drawing fancy boats for people who forget your name the minute they disembark." I folded the tablet and set it down. "You think running a resort that serves shrimp cocktail to strangers from Ohio is legacy?" He gave a slow, tight smile. "I think you'll regret burning every bridge you came from." I stood. "You already made sure those bridges collapsed." He didn't flinch. "You'll never be invited to anything with this family again, Brenna. Not weddings, not holidays, not funerals. You made your choice." I remember the sting of it, not because it was new, but because it was said aloud. It had always been the truth. Now it just had a timestamp. Standing there on the bow, watching the resort begin to fill with people who didn't even know I existed, I whispered the words out loud for the first time since that day. You were right. And still I wasn't angry. I felt calm. Not cold, just settled, like when a storm passes not with violence, but with silence. The kind that doesn't leave wreckage, just makes you walk outside and breathe deeper. From this distance, I could hear music starting, soft strings tuning, a speaker clicking on. The Vow Renewal was about to begin. The lawn shimmered with gold runners and ivory linens. Waitstaff carried trays in tight formations, and the photographer adjusted his lens toward the altar arch. I could almost hear my mother's voice directing someone just a little to the left. No, not that much. She'd be wearing something elegant. My father would be beaming like it was the coronation of their legacy, and none of them would be looking toward the water. Not yet. But they would. Soon. And they wouldn't be ready. From my position on the upper deck behind tinted glass, I could see it all, the guests filtering in the ivory folding chairs lined in curved rows across the lawn, the arch of lilies and white fabric swaying gently in the coastal breeze. It was an expensive kind of pretty planned, pruned, and pinned into place like a picture you hang for people who might never return. They had pulled out all the stops. I counted 3 servers per table, a live quartet, and someone with a clipboard directing seatings like it was a military operation. It probably was in my father's eyes. And at the center of it all stood my parents, Marshall and Colette Vale, flanked by golden lanterns and curated family smiles. My mother wore a soft champagne gown, high neckline, long sleeves, as if aging hadn't happened. My father wore a dark tailored suit with a military pin still visible on his left lapel, because of course he did. He looked every bit the coastal patriarch, shaking hands, laughing too loud, making eye contact like it was currency. They looked proud, practiced, complete. I watched the scene like someone watching a play written in a language they used to speak. I understood the gestures, but not the meaning anymore. One of the servers poured water into crystal glasses just as the string music dipped. A hush moved through the crowd that trained social cue that said, "Something is starting." I leaned slightly against the window, not close enough to be seen, but close enough to hear the mic switch on with a soft pop. My father stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Good afternoon," he began, smiling wide. "Thank you all for being here, for showing up, some of you from as far as Seattle, others just down the coast. We feel incredibly blessed." He paused for dramatic effect. He'd always loved the stage, whether that was a banquet or a backyard barbecue. He made people feel like their applause mattered. "Colette and I have been through many seasons," he continued. "Young love, hard years, triumphs, setbacks, and the gift of raising 2 amazing children. But through it all, what anchored us was this family. And not just in name. Family is who shows up, who stays close, and who makes us proud." The audience clapped on cue. My mother blinked slowly beside him, lips pressed into that serene, tasteful smile she'd perfected over decades. I didn't react. There was no sting this time, just that low hum again beneath the deck. the shift of something coming. Then came the tap on the glass. It was Dorian, calm as ever, with a nod and a quiet, "She's ready." I followed him down the narrow stairs to the control bridge. From there, our pilot Jules, a former naval engineer turned luxury vessel operator, checked his instrument panel and confirmed position. "Approaching rear dock," he said. "Tide's optimal. She'll cut straight through the inlet behind the ceremony site." "Visibility full." "Go," I said. Indara moved like breath. Slow, certain, silent enough to be elegant but heavy enough to draw presence. She rounded the bend of mangroves just as the officiant was stepping forward to begin the vow renewal. From the crowd's perspective, it probably began as a shimmer, a subtle motion on the water, then shape, then form, then name. Indara. Her hull gleamed in the sun, deep metallic bronze with mirrored trim, a color you couldn't buy, it had to be built. She glided in behind the resort lawn, perfectly framed by the arch where my parents stood reciting promises they'd already broken to at least one of their children. Guests began to turn. It started with the younger ones, the influencer couple whispering and lifting their phones. Then the Navy men trained to clock movement tilted their heads toward the shoreline. And then my father saw it. I watched from the deck window as he squinted slightly, adjusting his posture. My mother followed his gaze, her smile faltering for the briefest second, a twitch so small no one else would have noticed. But I did. The quartet trailed off. One of the servers stopped mid-pour. A breeze swept through, rustling the linen runners. Indara docked with precision, no ceremony, no announcement, no horns. Just presence. I stepped into view, dressed in the custom silk jumpsuit Isla had overnighted from Paris, midnight bronze structured collar, clean lines like a blade. I said nothing. I waved to no one. I simply existed. And for the first time in that carefully curated day, they didn't know what to do. They had told themselves I was gone, rewritten me out of the story. But I hadn't disappeared. I'd just learned to arrive differently. Indara cut through the water like she was born for this moment. There was no fanfare, no music, no scripted cue, just the soft churn of the sea and the gleam of her bronze hull catching the late morning light. From where I stood on the upper deck, I could see the entire lawn of the resort lined with its perfectly folded napkins and florals flown in from wherever my mother believed refinement lived. The name on the yacht's side, Indara, was crisp and unmistakable now, etched in silver script across the bow. It drew the eye like a lighthouse in still water. The guests noticed first. One by one, heads began to turn toward the shoreline. A soft rustling moved through the crowd, not wind, but curiosity. Champagne flutes stopped mid-air. Conversations trailed off. Phones hovered, uncertain whether to capture or pretend nothing was happening. Then a voice from the second row, low and half-whispered but loud enough to ripple. "Wait. That's Mistral's prototype, isn't it?" My father flinched barely and adjusted the lapel of his jacket like it had suddenly tightened. My mother tilted her head with rehearsed poise, scanning the dock as if it might vanish if she didn't react. But the name had already dropped. And anyone who knew anything about luxury marine design knew Mistral. Marine didn't do prototypes without purpose. A sleek black town car pulled up near the entrance of the resort lawn. From it stepped our event coordinator dressed in minimalist black, carrying an elegant mic. He didn't look toward the crowd. He looked toward the yacht. Then, evenly confidently, he spoke into the small receiver pinned at his collar. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, as though this had all been on the itinerary. "Please welcome the lead designer and CEO of Mistral Marine, Ms. Brenna Vale." The silence broke like a wave hitting stone. There was no applause, just stillness. My father's hand dropped from his lapel. My mother's jaw tightened. Jasper. My brother shifted uncomfortably beside his wife, who whispered something in his ear and looked away quickly. I stepped forward. No music played. No spotlight found me. I didn't need one. The moment lit itself. The silk jumpsuit Isla had made moved with weight and intention. Structured collar, tailored waist, a deep bronze so rich it caught the undertones of the yacht beneath me. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just walked to the bow and looked out at them, my family, their friends, their curated guests and shallow toasts and perfect centerpieces. From the resort's edge, a woman raised her phone and began filming. Then another. Within seconds, people were murmuring again, asking each other what Mistral Marine was doing here, why I had the same last name as the couple being honored, whether this was a publicity stunt or a mistake. It was neither. This wasn't a crash. I hadn't stepped onto their lawn or spoken over their ceremony. I hadn't taken the mic or raised my voice. I simply arrived where I was already meant to be, where I had every right to be, because I wasn't the interruption. I was the moment. A man near the front, one of Dad's longtime business friends, an oil exec who used to call me kiddo at barbecues, lowered his sunglasses and looked at me with full recognition. I saw it hit him. Not just who I was, but what I'd become. Mistral Marine, the mysterious minimalist design house that had taken over 3 international markets in the last 2 years. No interviews, no public founder, only speculation elegance and waiting lists. And now, a name. I let the silence stretch. Not out of drama, but weight. I wanted them to feel it. Not the spectacle, but the shift. My mother was the first to react. She stepped toward the edge of the lawn and said carefully, "We weren't expecting you." I met her eyes and replied without raising my voice. "You weren't invited to mine either, but I still sent champagne." Her lips parted like she might protest, but she said nothing. Dorian appeared beside me, calm and unfazed, holding a tablet. "Guests are requesting a private tour," he murmured. "Should I begin the rotations?" I nodded. "Also," he added, without looking up, "your father's primary investor just asked if they could speak to you privately regarding a potential collaboration." Of course he did. I turned back toward the dock as the first guests, politely disengaging from the Vow Renewal crowd, began to make their way toward Andara. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to shift the center of gravity. I didn't wave anyone over. I didn't signal. But the tide had changed, and this time it was pulling in my direction. As I descended toward the lower deck, I passed by a decorative placard mounted near the entryway of the yacht. It read, "Designed in silence. Built for presence." I hadn't planned for that to be public. But maybe it was perfect. After all, I wasn't there to make noise. I was there to make impact. The sound of crystal hitting stone isn't loud, but when it happens in silence, it's all anyone hears. My mother's wine flute slipped from her fingers the moment she realized the name echoing through the speakers wasn't just similar to mine, it was mine. It hit the slate tile beneath her heels, shattered into 5 clean pieces, and released a splash of champagne that caught the hem of her gown. She didn't move to pick it up. She just stood there blinking like she wasn't sure if the glass had broken or if she had. Beside her, Jasper's wife, Rachel, reacted a beat too slowly. She reached down and dabbed the spill with a napkin while glancing around, pretending not to notice that half the crowd had already turned toward the dock. She tried to keep smiling, but it was the tight kind, social strained survival mode. A woman who sensed the power shift and didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of it. My father didn't move. He stood at the edge of the lawn, shoulders square, mouth neutral, like a statue caught between command and collapse. I could see it in his eyes, the calculation, the effort to hold on to control of the room. But it was slipping, and he knew it. Dorian was already working through the guest list, moving like a conductor in motion. With practiced discretion, he approached each high-value guest one by one, offering quiet invitations for a private walkthrough aboard Andara. "If you'd like a closer look," he said in his even cordial tone, "the designer is available to answer questions personally." People didn't hesitate. One of my father's biggest sponsors, the same man who'd written checks for resort expansions and once called me unfocused, was already headed down the boardwalk, his wife trailing behind, wide-eyed. A group of investors from Miami followed. Even the reality TV couple whose only discernible talent was turning public moments into brand deals were whispering to their manager and adjusting their sunglasses as they followed the current. My mother stepped forward. "Brenna," she said, trying to gather herself. "What is this?" I didn't stop walking. I didn't raise my voice or break stride. I passed her the way I'd passed her 100 times in my life, right there, arm's length apart, and still somehow miles away. At the edge of the reception space where the ceremony arch framed the open lawn and the sea beyond, my father stood rooted like a man waiting for an explanation. But he didn't deserve one. Not after all the years of pretending I didn't exist, not after turning silence into strategy. I walked right past him, and as I did, I looked up just enough for him to meet my eyes and said, with nothing but calm, "Congratulations. Looks like you finally got the perfect family photo." He flinched, just slightly, but it was enough. I didn't wait for a reply. By the time I stepped back aboard, Andara guests were already lining up the gangway, escorted in groups of 4. The staff welcomed them with chilled towels and champagne flutes far finer than the ones my mother had ordered. Elise handled the tour with effortless elegance, moving from the carbon-lined helm to the mirrored galley like she was guiding royalty. Every detail gleamed. Inside the main salon, one of the Miami investors turned to me and said, "We've been trying to get in touch with whoever runs Mistral for over a year. Didn't expect her to show up behind the ceremony." I smiled without apology. Neither did they. Another guest laughed, just one, just enough, and the air shifted. Not into cruelty, just understanding, recognition. Back on the resort lawn, the music resumed. Someone restarted the playlist, but it didn't matter anymore. The center of gravity had moved, and everyone knew it. From the upper deck, I watched as my father finally stepped away from the altar and walked slowly toward the catering table, shoulders tighter than before. My mother whispered something to Jasper, who didn't reply. He was staring at Andara, his jaw set, arms crossed, like a boy caught in a storm without an umbrella. I didn't feel triumphant. I wasn't here to gloat. But I had shown up, and this time they couldn't pretend I hadn't. Not when half their guest list was boarding my deck. Not when the name they tried to bury was etched into the side of the vessel they couldn't stop staring at. By evening, the lawn had been cleared. The floral arch came down first, quietly disassembled by staff in black polos, followed by the cocktail tables and string lights that never got to finish their glow. The air still smelled faintly of salt and roses, but the party was over, even if no one said it out loud. Back aboard Andara, we hosted a soft closing reception for select guests. It wasn't loud or showy, just champagne, caviar, and the kind of conversation that moved markets. I didn't mingle much. Elise handled most of the guests with her usual grace, and Dorian was already fielding inquiries about future commissions. I stood near the helm, letting the night wrap around us like a velvet curtain, quiet and clean. Then, Dorian approached with a tablet in hand, and that particular glint in his eye. He didn't say anything right away, just handed me the screen. It was an email, short, formal, from the lead partner at Coastline Holdings, the same man who'd funded nearly every Vale Shore resort renovation over the last decade. The subject line read, "Strategic Redirection Notice." The body was barely 3 lines long. Effective immediately, we are reallocating all pending capital toward Mistral Marine's oceanfront innovation corridor. We believe your leadership represents the future of sustainable luxury development. We wish the Vale family continued success. I stared at the words for a full 10 seconds before passing the tablet back. Dorian didn't smirk. He didn't need to. He simply said, "There's a follow-up call scheduled for Monday morning. They want to formalize the announcement by Q3. I nodded, and that was that. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even personal. It was gravity. The kind of shift that happens when a name once dismissed becomes the name others whisper toward. My father had spent years clinging to the idea that legacy came from control, from appearances, institutions, and connections. But legacy, like tide, doesn't wait for permission. It moves toward relevance. And tonight, relevance had docked 20 feet from his altar. Around 9:00 p.m., after the last guest left and the decks had been cleared, I returned to my cabin. The evening air drifted through the open hatch, carrying laughter from a distant yacht and the soft ripple of water against hull. I sat down at my desk to go through notes when my phone lit up with a message. From my mother. "We didn't know you'd be there." That was all it said. Not "how are you," not "you looked well," not even "thank you for being respectful." Just one clean sentence that walked the line between explanation and excuse. I didn't hesitate. I typed back, "You didn't ask." No flourish, no signature, no invitation to continue, because that was the truth. They hadn't asked, not when I left, not when I built, not when I succeeded. They never asked what I was building, what I dreamed of, or whether I still wanted a place at the table. And after a while, you stop wanting to be asked. You just start building the table yourself. I set the phone down and stared out the small window near my desk. In the distance, the faint glow of the resort was dimming. One light in the main villa still flickered a hallway maybe, or someone pacing a bedroom uncertain what the story would be tomorrow. They'd find a way to spin it. They always did. But the truth had already landed. Not in anger, not in spectacle, just in presence. Measured. Real. The shift had come and it didn't need my permission. Only my name. The box was waiting when I returned to Miami. A small taped-up rectangle with my name handwritten in the corner, the ink slightly smudged like it had been written in a hurry. The return address was familiar Anita Farrell, an old friend of my mother's, who used to sneak me extra lemon bars at church potlucks and call me her quiet little captain. I hadn't seen her in years, not since I'd left town without saying goodbye. I carried the box inside my apartment and set it on the kitchen counter without opening it. For a full day, it just sat there. I moved around it, made coffee, took calls, sketched hull lines in my notebook, folded laundry, but the box stayed where it was. Watching. It wasn't heavy, but it had weight. I finally opened it on a rainy Sunday afternoon. The kind of soft gray day that doesn't ask for productivity, just honesty. Inside was a stack of letters, some in envelopes, others loose folded and refolded like they'd been handled more than once. There was a note on top in Anita's neat looping script. "Brenna, I debated for years whether to pass these along. I wasn't sure it would help, but I also wasn't sure it was mine to keep. A." I pulled the first letter out carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's perfect cursive slanted slightly right, looping just enough to seem warm, but never messy. The date on the first one was from the fall I left grad school. "Dear Brenna, I don't know why you think you have to do this the hard way. You've always been clever, but this isn't how the world works. Your father's angry, yes, but only because he expected more from you. I wish you'd come home. We could still fix this, fix what I'd wondered back then. I hadn't broken anything." The second letter was dated months later in winter. "I've spoken to the trust attorney. Nothing is final yet. But you need to understand your silence helps everyone. We don't want a public mess. If you love this family, don't make this harder than it needs to be." That one hit harder than the first. Not because it surprised me, but because it didn't. There were more. Dozens. Some were soft and almost maternal. "I miss your handwriting. I bought a scarf today that reminded me of the one you left behind." Some were sharp-edged and transactional. "If you agree not to challenge the documents, we could revisit the terms privately." One dated just after my 25th birthday simply read, "You've made your choice. So we've made ours. I hope someday you'll understand." They had rewritten history in real time. While I was building something from the ground up, they were constructing their own version of me in the shadows, irresponsible, erratic, emotional. The daughter who left for a boy. The one who wouldn't listen. The one who forfeited her place. I read every letter slowly, deliberately. Not because I needed answers, but because I needed to finally see the full shape of the silence I'd carried for years. And when I finished, I didn't cry. I just sat there, fingers pressed lightly to the edge of the last page, and breathed, because this was the end of something. Not a chapter. A permission. I didn't need their apology. Not anymore. Apologies require a foundation of truth. And the truth was, they knew what they'd done. They just didn't want to be the ones to say it out loud. I placed the letters back in the box gently, as if they still contained something fragile. I sealed the lid with a single strip of tape and wrote a word across the top in permanent marker kept. Not forgiven, not forgotten. Just kept. A record. A reckoning. Not so I could use them against anyone, but so I could stop using them against myself. I tucked the box into a cabinet in my studio closet behind a row of fabric swatches and archived press kits. It wouldn't be on display. It didn't need to be. Some truths don't require spotlight. They just need somewhere to rest. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't holding it anymore. The evening breeze curled off the marina like a second skin, cool, familiar, scented faintly with salt and citrus from the trees planted along the dock. We'd anchored Andara just far enough from the main slip to avoid attention, but close enough that guests could board without climbing over camera lenses or cocktail chatter. That was intentional. I didn't want spectacle. Not tonight. The guest list was short, just 12. People who had seen me before the headlines, before the silence, before I learned to speak in design instead of defense. Dorian was there, of course, seated beside Elise, who had traded her uniform for a soft linen blouse and red lipstick. Across from them was Tova, my first mentor from the Key West boatyard, the woman who taught me to weld without apology and told me bluntly, "If you want pretty, go paint. If you want power, build something that floats." She was grayer now, but her laugh hadn't changed. There were others, a client-turned-friend who once took a risk on my unknown firm, the marine law professor who helped me structure Mistral's original licensing language, and Ren, my COO, who had come to me fresh out of grad school and stayed even when the pay was barely enough to cover rent. Each of them had given me something no one in my family ever had: belief without condition. We sat around the dining table beneath Andara's canopy, the lighting soft and golden, casting long shadows across polished teak. No press. No name tags, no strategic alliances, just real people, real wine, real conversation, and a meal prepared by a chef I had found years ago at a roadside seafood shack on Highway 1. He now ran kitchens on 3 continents, but when I called, he said, "For you, I'll bring the knives myself." The food was exceptional, but that wasn't the point. It never had been. The point was, this table existed, and I didn't have to ask for a seat. I made it. I measured the wood, bolted the legs, stained the surface, and decided who sat beside me. No monogrammed programs, no assigned rows. Halfway through dessert, a coconut tart with just the right bite of lime. Tova raised her glass. "You know," she said, leaning back, "you're the kind of woman who doesn't need a seat at their table." She held the glass steady, her eyes locked on mine. "You built your own." It was quiet for a beat after that, not out of awkwardness, but reverence. The kind of silence that knows not to rush a truth. I didn't deflect. I didn't laugh or shake my head or say something self-deprecating like I used to. I just nodded gently and clinked my glass to hers. "Thank you," I said, because she was right, and I wasn't afraid to accept that anymore. Later, as the party drifted into murmured stories and second pours, I stepped out onto the bow, alone. The harbor glowed in the distance, warm lights, quiet music from a yacht 2 docks over, the clink of glasses from strangers celebrating something that probably didn't require so many sparklers. I stood there for a while, letting the breeze run its fingers through my hair, the hum of Andara beneath my feet, steady and earned. This ship didn't just float, she carried me. Somewhere back on land, my family was probably still explaining the weekend to whoever would listen, why guests had left early, why their biggest investor had pulled out, why a yacht had stolen the show without ever crossing the property line. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I didn't need their table, or their apology, or their invitation. I had something better, a seat of my own. I opened my laptop late, long after the last message had been read and the marina lights had dimmed. The cursor blinked against a blank email screen, waiting like a held breath. I didn't know if I meant to write or just sit in the quiet with the option in front of me. The to line stayed empty. I wasn't even sure if my mother still used the same address. She changed accounts often for security, though I always suspected it was just another way to keep control of the narrative. But I didn't need her to receive it. I just needed to say it to someone, even if it was just the blinking cursor and me. My fingers hovered, then began. "Dear Mom, I'm not angry." I stopped there. Let the words settle. That part was true. I wasn't angry, not anymore. The anger had burned itself out years ago when I realized the silence wasn't temporary. When birthdays passed without a message and photos, I was once part of got replaced with better lighting, tighter crops, and no trace of me. I typed again slower now. I'm not angry, but I won't pretend you didn't choose the version of me that made you most comfortable. The one who was reckless, ungrateful, emotional. That story fit easier into dinner parties and alumni newsletters than the one where I left because I couldn't keep shrinking into someone you approved of. I paused, watching the lines take shape on the screen. It wasn't venom. It wasn't revenge. It was just accurate. I understand now that you needed control, that you measured love in loyalty and silence. I used to think that if I said the right things, if I did enough, I could earn my place back. But I don't want back in anymore. That table wasn't built for me, and I'm done trying to squeeze into corners just to be near it. The cursor blinked again, waiting for more. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the soft hum of Endara's systems beneath the floor, the faint sway of her weight settling into the water. This yacht had become my compass. Everything that once made me feel small had been redesigned into something that moved forward on its own terms. I glanced back at the screen, thought about ending the message with kindness or a half-hearted bridge, "I hope you're well," but that would have been dishonest. Not because I didn't wish her peace, but because this wasn't a peace offering. It was a boundary, a quiet one, but firm. Instead, I read the words one more time. Then I hit delete. Not save, not send, just delete. And it felt light. Not empty, not unresolved. Just done. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes when you stop chasing what you'll never catch. I had spent so many years holding out hope that someone would rewrite their ending of my story to include me. But I'd written my own chapters, and those pages held more truth than any edited version they'd tucked behind polite smiles and curated speeches. I closed the laptop. No ceremony. No drama. Just the sound of the hinge clicking shut. Outside, the water was calm again. The marina had gone still, save for the occasional creak of dock lines adjusting to the tide. I walked out to the stern barefoot, wrapping a light sweater around my shoulders. The air smelled like night, briny and soft, like the hush after a storm. I thought about all the things I'd said without speaking, the way I showed up, the way Endara had moved into view with elegance and certainty. That was my letter. That was my reply. And she had already read it, even if she never admitted it. I stayed there a while longer, letting the breeze move around me, then turned and stepped back inside. I had nothing left to explain. 1 year later, the marina looks different, cleaner, sharper. The walkways are new, the signage elegant and understated. Palm trees have been replanted along the edge of the water, spaced with intention, not decoration. It's subtle, but you can feel the shift, the way the water moves, the way people pause to look up as they pass. Mistral Marine now owns 4 slips in the main office building. The lobby has no receptionist desk, just a framed view of the ocean and the quiet hum of innovation beneath polished concrete floors. A new prototype is under development, longer, leaner, carbon frame hybrid propulsion. The name isn't final, but I already know what she'll be: deliberate, enduring, and impossible to overlook. On the dock, a small brushed metal plaque gleams against the sunlight. It reads, Mistral Marine Headquarters Est. By B. Vale. There's no logo, no press photo, no fanfare. Just permanence. I visit the yard early before the crews arrive, when the water is still and the only sounds are gulls circling somewhere behind the mangroves. I like this hour. It's when the world isn't quite awake and nothing demands explanation. After checking in with Wren and reviewing a few updates on the structural renderings, I take the long way back toward town. The footpath winds along the edge of the coastline and eventually brushes up against the property line of Vale Shore Resort. I don't mean to slow down, but I do. The resort is still standing, but it's no longer thriving. The lawn is patchier than I remember. The chairs look rented, not replaced. A sandwich board out front advertises midweek specials and discounted Vow Renewal packages 20% off for returning couples. I watch for a moment from a distance. There are no photographers, no champagne carts, Just a pair of staff rearranging sun umbrellas, one of which keeps leaning no matter how they anchor it. I can't see my parents. I don't know if they're still living on site or if they've retreated into some private wing of the property away from the memory of what that weekend cost them. I don't feel pity, but I don't feel pride either. The truth is, I didn't take anything from them. Not really. I didn't go after their investors or steal their clients or leak stories to the press. I simply built what I always said I would, and I did it better than they thought possible. That was all. What happened next? That was gravity. Choices land where they're meant to. A jogger passes me on the path, earbuds in, unaware of the layers beneath this stretch of coast. To him, it's just waterfront. To others, maybe a photo op. But I remember the summers I spent sitting cross-legged on the old dock, sketching hulls with sunburned shoulders and graphite under my fingernails, dreaming of boats no one had ever seen. They laughed at me back then, not in front of me, of course, but in quiet rooms behind closed doors during carefully phrased conversations with family friends. She's doing something in Key West, I think. Designing or maybe crewing. You know how she is. Now I'm the headline they can't control. I take one last look at the weathered sign above the resort gate. It's faded, the letters slightly chipped. Someone's tried to repaint them, but the gold doesn't hold like it used to. I turn away. Back at the marina, a small group of apprentices waits on the floating dock, notebooks in hand. We've started bringing in local students' kids who've never stepped foot on a yacht but know instinctively how the water moves beneath them. I see parts of myself in them. The hunger, the vision, the quiet defiance. One of them points to the new prototype under tarp and asks if she'll get to see it launched. Maybe I say, if she earns it. The girl grins. I smile back. The wind shifts slightly, lifting the hem of my coat and brushing across the surface of the bay. I glance once more in the direction of the resort, not to gloat, not to linger, just to mark the line, the one they drew, the one I crossed. They didn't invite me, but they built their stage on my waters.